Welcome to the Sports Entrepreneurs Podcast. I'm your host, Marcus Luhr, and today we're crossing over to London, UK again to catch up with Mr. Andrew Croker. Welcome to the podcast, Andrew.
Thank you, Marcus.
You're welcome. I'm looking forward to our conversation here. We were just chatting a bit before I was warming up here on what we're doing and maybe some opportunities for us to do some interesting things together here. But before we get into that, I'd love to just quickly do an intro and sort of do a bit quite a summary on yourself. And even though I haven't quite worked out yet what we're going to be titling this podcast, but it might be something along the line as Mr. Chairman. Because you've been chairman of so many different companies and businesses, and I really, see that, and I'd love to dig more deeper into it later of, these roles you play there in these companies and what that means. That's going to be really interesting. But obviously, before you ever became a chairman, you've had an illustrious career across the industry, from the IMGs to Sport 5. Of course, everyone knows you as a co-founder and the executive chairman of Perform and Dazn for many years. And because many other roles you played then in between, which we're going to be touching on, and of course we'll end a bit with your current role, or one of the current roles you're in with Oakville Sports Advisory there again as the chairman of the advisory board. So, but before we get back to that, let's start a bit how your career started. You were with B Sky B. Tell us a bit about it. We're in the mid or late 80s here now. I guess that must, B Sky B must have literally just started, and I'm assuming you were one of the first heads of sports there. So take us back to those days and tell us a bit about it.
Okay. Well, actually, it goes, it's connected, but I have to go back to ancient history, which is 1973.
Please.
And obviously, I'm going to skip my childhood because I don't think anyone's interested in that. But in 1973, I decided to come to London and train to be an accountant, and to be an accountant because I couldn't think of anything else. And completely out of nowhere, because my father was, while he had been a professional footballer, he'd also been a pilot, he'd also been an industrialist, and a very successful one. He had decided, and not told me, and in fact didn't tell my mother for quite a long time, that he was applying for the job to be General Secretary of the FA, the English Football Association.
Oh, wow.
And I was obviously shocked when I found out that he had got the job, and bizarrely he started at Lancaster Gate, which was the headquarters of the English FA, in the same month that I came to London to do my articles. And part of his job was that he got an apartment above the FA, and because being an articled clerk in accountancy, my annual salary then was £680. And also, bizarrely, the very, very first audit they sent me on was the International Tennis Federation. So there was obviously some sort of symmetry going on there. And then with my father, I was immediately immersed in the world of football politics and what was going on. And I was in the boardroom of every... I was in Arsenal, Chelsea. We were three, 4 times a week. We were with the games, so I got to meet everybody in sport and broadcasting throughout the 70s, and we socialised with them, and it was enormous fun. But you couldn't have had a better training, if you like, or background to be involved in sport. And so then when I qualified,
you were in your early 20s at that time, or what? Just give me
I was 20 years old when I came. So from the age of 20 to 25, I was trained to be accountant, and then I went to work for Ladbrokes, which is a betting business, but also in the racecourse business and social clubs and everything. So that was a great education. And it was only then when I sort of had a lot of friends who were, they were working in BBC Sport or whatever, or they were in ITV Sport or whatever, and I then got involved with a company called Cheerleader Productions, which was the company that introduced American football to a very unsuspecting audience on Channel 4, which was a new broadcaster back in the early 80s.
Right,
and that was then how I got into it. And the funny thing is, you mentioned earlier about me being known as the chairman, is that from that day on, I'd never had a job that I succeeded anybody else. I never filled a role that somebody else had had before me. Everything I've ever done is a startup. I've never. There's a great saying, and I don't know where it came from or who said it first, which is there are finders, binders, and minders, and some people add to that grinders. But and I think it's a different skill set. But I was always a finder. I just found that I went out, I met people, I heard about things, I saw stuff sort of happened, and I was quite good at binding as well. So I was always a startup guy, right. But I always relied very heavily on people who actually knew what they were doing and actually how to run a business, because I was never that brilliant at minding the shop. I was quite good at getting out on the road and being a road warrior. And so that's really what I did. And coming back to your question about BSB, I was with my father. My father said, "Have you heard of this BSB?" I said, "Well, not really." And that was when it was just an idea, and the government had decided to give somebody a government-backed monopoly to do DTH television, right. Which was a great idea until Rupert Murdoch said he launched an Astra satellite, and suddenly there was a cheap and cheerful alternative which actually worked technically. But I went to BSB, and I went and just pitched to them when my father said, "You should go meet these guys." And they had no programming, nothing. Right. And I pitched them the idea of doing two hours of sport every night. And they said, "Well, that's quite interesting, but why don't you come here and work and do it?" So I became employee number 5 or 7, I can't remember, at BSB. Right. And I arrived there, and within a month, they'd gone from, actually, could you do 4 hours a day? And then it was, could you do 6 hours a day? And then it was, could you do 8 hours a day and we'll run it 3 times? So actually, could we have a sports channel? Right. And I literally remember getting in a pencil and a ruler, and drawing a weekly schedule, and going to the photocopier and punching 52 and putting it in a ring binder and looking at this empty file with blank sheets of paper, and we just started to create a sports channel. And I loved that. Was one of the most exciting things I ever did, because you had to go off and meet federations and rights holders and explain who you are, explain what you were going to do, and how viewers were going to see it or not. And that's amazing. What we did, and that effectively became Sky that Murdoch created, nearly bankrupted him. And when the infamous so-called merger happened, the only piece of BSB that survived was the sports channel, because we had UK rights and he'd been depending on Eurosport, which wasn't really relevant to a UK audience. Yeah. And so the sports channel, which is where Vic Wakely worked and where Martin Tyler was and where Andy Gray was and all the rest of them, that became Sky Sports. So by that time I had left and gone on to do something else. So, but that was the history. And that's how I sort of really got into certainly sports TV, sports media.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I mean, when you were there, and having your father obviously, I'm assuming still involved in the FA, or do you guys ever do a deal with them as well? Did you have some of the rights?
Yeah, we did. We did, because the first rights deals we did were. We did the Scottish Premier League. We had the FA, so we had sort of the FA Cup and England teams. Right. So we did, and I think I remember him saying at the time, it's not a reason. Me being there was not a reason to do business, but it wasn't a reason not to do business either. Right. And it made a lot of sense. Yeah. We were the new kids on the block, and we paid good rights fees. I mean, I remember our total budget for the first year was 35 million, and because we had an infamous thing that some people remember called a square-eel. This was the idea that it wasn't a dish, it looked like a bird table. Uh-huh. Unfortunately, it did turn out that it was actually better as a bird table than as a receiving dish. And at the end of our first year, we worked out it would have been cheaper to send all our viewers, put them on a plane and send them to the events that we broadcast than actually spend the money on the rights.
Amazing. Well, great. I love that. That's a great warm-up story here.
It was an amazing time. It was an amazing time.
I can imagine. Yeah, and I have to admit that I didn't know the link there with your father. That's very cool too. Love that. So let's move on then from I guess the early days there, a couple of years with B Sky B. You ended up with IMG pretty much on the back of it, I think. Well, there's actually sort of a couple of years in between, which I'm not sure where you went, but which one would you consider your next stop?
I went to work for. It was bizarre. I was on, because I'll tell the story. I was in New York on business for B Sky B, and to cut a very long story short, British Airways bumped me off my plane. I was coming back, and then they ran me up and said, would you like to go on Concorde tomorrow morning? I went, yeah, okay. So I found myself on Concorde, which I thought was great, having just bought a regular British Airways ticket.
Yeah.
And I found myself next to a man who is now Sir Frank Lowe, who is, without question, a legend of the advertising industry.
Yeah, of course.
He was a little frustrated about where it was going. But he was the guy behind Stella Artois doing the tennis tournament, which everyone remembers and remembers the great advertising. But he wanted to grow a sports marketing business. As a result of our plane ride, I ended up going to run his sports marketing business called Orbit. And that's where I spent a lot of time working. I started up, it was called the White Company before, but we rebranded it as Orbit. And we had clients like Coca-Cola and Stella Artois, worked in Formula One, had a huge amount of fun. And then towards the end of it, we were trying to do a deal to buy CPMA, Alan Callan's business, and represent Rugby World Cup rights. And I couldn't. I was with a guy called Paul Smith, who worked at RSL, who's a very well-known guy in our industry. You know Paul. And we just couldn't get this square peg of buying something on future revenues into this round hole of the way into public group for advertising agencies. And it was so frustrating that we thought, if we don't get this deal done, we'll never get a big deal done. So I was ready to jump ship. And ironically, I had a breakfast meeting at the Carlton Tower with Ian Todd, who I think everybody knows, who was, McCormack's first employee outside the USA and built and ran IMG outside the USA, and is a lifelong friend of mine and one of the best operators I've ever met in our space. And I met him, and he ended up doing the deal for the ring. And he also said two things to me. One, come and ride the Amateur Day in the Tour de France, which led to something pretty amazing. And then the other one was, it's ridiculous. IMG has never had biggest agency in the world, and we don't do anything in the biggest sport in the world. He said, why don't you come and run the football division? So I said, okay. I said, well, can Paul Smith come with me? And he said, okay. And the two of us went off to really kickstart IMG's football division. And that's, that was in 94. And we just hit the ground running and had an amazing time at IMG. It was good fun.
Yeah, no, I love that. Yeah, so the part about Frank Lowe and Orbit, that's clearly the one I was missing there. But again, even that part sounds like a lot of fun and I guess several years.
Very interesting time, and it taught me a lot because we were working with sponsors, and the sponsors were our clients. Yeah. We did a Braun deal in Formula One, and I had a lot of fun and learnt a lot. There was a guy called Ian White, who many will remember, who was really understood brands and marketing, and it was a massive part of my education.
Yeah, no, I can imagine.
When I got to IMG, the football division, I couldn't claim the credit for it because you will remember it well, but the IMG had got out of Hong Kong, which was Brett McCormack, Mark McCormack's son was there, yep. And they were in the advanced stages of a deal with the Chinese to form the Marlborough League, dare I say it, yeah. And also at the same time we launched the Phillips Cup, and it was really replicating the league structure that was in the UK, and we'd worked on the Premier League formation, and that was a huge success. But it sort of, better than me, it sort of imploded a few years later. Yeah. But at the same time we were representing the FA and Wembley here in the UK, and those were the two really big projects that got us going. And then we did a lot of federation marketing, in India, Argentina, Russia. We sort of replicated the model, around the world and had a really good time. Though Mark was very keen we should get into managing football players, which I really, really didn't want to do and was not my thing at all.
Oh, yeah, and well, obviously they're representing tons of other players in other sports, so that seemed to be an obvious. But I don't think they really ever got that deep into it, really. Managing
footballers is very different. When you're managing tennis players and golfers, they need a deal every week. They need a hotel every week. They need a flight every week. They need a coach. Right. They need a tax return. And they have their own passports. They're much, much more complicated and also, in many ways, many more opportunities. And then footballers, it was all about the transfer deals, right. Because once they, were with a football club, they were an employee. The club had their passport. They told them what bus to get on, where to go, what they would be doing every day of the week. Very different dynamic, but also the whole area of football agents was far, far, far less regulated or gentlemanly
during those
than
days.
someone like David Falk will tell you about, or Donald Dell or whatever. The world of tennis and golf is much more civilized, I would say. Football transfers to this day is still the Wild West.
Yeah, absolutely. As we see different every time, and every time there is the trading window is up there for sure.
We were managing, so we did. I did go off and do a deal with some football agents, and we brought them into the family.
I love it. Yeah, I'm sure there's football stories are always interesting. I had some player managers on it, and amazing stuff. Now let's move a bit, a couple of years up then, and all of a sudden we have the .com boom era. And I'm certain, like someone like you said, who said, he looks always at opportunities and finds new things. I'm sure you saw that as well, what was happening. And I know you joined, Sportel at that time in a role here. It says at least marketing director. And of course we got Rob Hershoff there and a few other guys, again, well known in the industry. Tell us a bit about that. I mean, this was obviously, it was an amazing idea, and it went very quickly up and then down, right?
It was a lot of fun. At the end at IMG, I always say I had 5 great years at IMG, but unfortunately I was there for 6. So the last year was very frustrating. Ian Todd had left. We had started to get, in the very early days of digital, and there was still a very good friend of mine, Greg Davis, who was there, and we had managed to do 3 what I would call website deals, because it was all about websites then. Yeah. And our first 3 deals we did were Barcelona, Brazil, and Manchester United. And we had these deals, and I really felt we should kick on, but then I did leave because I got the opportunity to go and get involved with Sportal, which was a lot of fun. Rob Hershoff, very charismatic. I think was just a brilliant idea, which has been borne out by what has happened since. But it didn't work in the days of dial-up. I mean, there just was not the connectivity out there to support the vision and the ideas that it had, that you were going to create this, commercial digital environment for football clubs to interact with their fans, whether it was video or selling merchandise or whatever else it was, and all those other things. And I felt that IMG dropped the ball digitally after we left, and Sportal was just a great idea, but the shareholders didn't have infinitely deep pockets. And we were so close to getting it away and selling it. I remember I went one of the most bizarre meetings of my life. I flew to New York with Rob Hershoff, and we had lunch in Rupert Murdoch's private dining room with Rupert Murdoch, Lachlan Murdoch, and James Murdoch. And Rob, who knew Rupert and had worked for him in a previous life, pitched in the idea of buying Sportal. Right. And it was one of those conversations where after about 10 minutes I hadn't spoken. I thought, I'm not going to speak here. And then eventually there was an opportunity, and then it carried on as a normal lunch. But it was enormous fun watching the 3 of them interacting, or the 4 of them really. And then we had a real run at selling the business to Canal Plus, Sport Plus, where my great friend Jerome Valk was. Yeah. And at the same time, I think Chris Akers had sold his sports internet group for 300 million to Sky, if you remember. Tony Ball was there. Yeah, and then we had the collapse of NASDAQ and all tech stocks, and that was it. The game was over. Yeah. And then it all just sort of that was it.
Really fast. I heard Stephen Nuttall I was listening to one of his. He had a podcast on another podcast here recently, and he was saying the same thing. He basically said, maybe you got it all. You were wrong. You missed it by a few weeks. I mean, not just even.
Oh, it was literally weeks. Yeah, it was literally. John Gleasia was there. Gleasia was there. I hired John Gleasia. Steve Nuttall was there. There were a lot of fun people. Listen, we had. It was a classic .com boom story, but it was great. I mean, I think ironically, I think Sportal Germany, was still owned by Perform or Dazn, one or the other. It was always a great brand. I mean, I actually flew back from South Africa to negotiate. We were negotiating to be the shirt sponsor for Manchester United. It just shows how sometimes these things get a bit silly, really. Yeah. But and we were a sponsor of the Euros, which must have been I suppose in the summer of 2000, Euro 2000, we were sponsoring.
Because you guys were running their website, right? I think that was part of it, right?
Yes, correct. Yeah. Listen, it was a great time. I had a lot of fun. And certainly learned a lot. And
it's an interesting one.
But the thing was, I'd always kept my relationship, because when I was at IMG, one of the bigger deals we did towards the end was we had pitched jointly for the Premier League international TV rights. And we had done it as a three-way deal, basically between IMG, Sport Plus, which was being run by Jerome Valk as part of Canal Plus, and Ian Frickberg, who was doing it on behalf of Fox/News Corp. Right. And we had that we did that as a 4-year deal. I want to say 98, and then everybody was very keen to renew it in the next cycle. So that's why Jerome Valk asked me to sort of stay involved with Sport Plus and consult with them. So that's what I was doing, based in London. And that was good fun. It was quite low key. And then they created Sport 5. You'll remember, obviously, it was Sports and Sport Plus and Jean-Claude Darmon, which created this new thing, Sport 5. And I worked on the next cycle of the Premier League. And I had an agreement with Jerome that if we got that, I would stay on for 4 years to manage that relationship with the Premier League, which we did. And then I couldn't work with Darmon and his people. Jerome left to go off and on FIFA, which is another story. And I then had my relationship then became with the guys in Hamburg. So Robert Muller and Philippe Cordes and all those guys that you know very well. I was
just on the phone with Robert earlier.
So that was a very happy time. I really liked working with them. It was very good. I had, a young family. There was very little. I just did whatever I wanted to do, and I was based in London. So I had sort of 6 odd years doing that Premier League relationship, little bit of business, bought a couple of businesses in the UK for Sport 5. Really enjoyed working with the German guys, the guys out of Hamburg. They were very good fun, but they too were frustrated by the whole Darmon thing and then the Lagardère thing, and it was all, that's another very messy chapter.
Exactly. And actually, Robert has been on the podcast too, and we dissected, and he's obviously been there from the start and is still there now, right? So we literally went through the entire Sport 5 and then Lagardère and back to Sport 5 and then, or whatever names were in between. And so it's a crazy story. So you had your little fair share of that, I guess, as the sort of CEO in the UK, right? That was sort of, and I guess an international board member at that time. Interesting. Now, from then, is this already then when you sort of started to, have this, I guess not Dazn, sorry, Perform started to show up and emerge on your radar? Is that sort of, I guess, coming out of?
I'll tell you exactly what happened.
Please.
There was a team of people in Hamburg, and they were trying to decide. They felt they needed to get into the digital production space. Is that you had these guys in Hamburg trading rights, and everybody knows what the business was. You were buying rights from federations, aggregating those rights. The similar thing was happening in France, and they felt they had a huge amount of content passing through these organizations, but they weren't doing anything to monetize that content beyond licensing it to broadcasters. Right. So they were trying to say, what should we do? We need a plan.
Who was the group in France? I didn't catch that.
Well, obviously that was the Darmon, Jean-Claude Darmon bit and the Sport Plus, Sport Plus bit. So they were doing what they wanted to do, and they hadn't got some young consultant in Hamburg had written an idea about what they should do. And it was just complete garbage, and so they said to me, Andrew, would you come up with a plan for what we should do? So I said, okay. And I just went off, and I think 3 or 4 months, I just went to see everybody, and I cold called people. And one of the people I cold called was Ollie Slipper. And Ollie Slipper was running premium TV, which was a big fallout of what had happened digital and doing all these crazy deals with football clubs in the UK. Right. And I went to see him, and I just thought he was such a really good, fun, bright young guy. And Premium TV looked like a good business, but it was owned by the bondholders. It should have gone bust, but it was going along, and they were really trying to turn it around and sell it. And obviously I knew Simon Denyer as well and everything. And it became clear to me. I pitched to the guys in Germany. I said, if you're going to do a production thing and you want to get into the content space, you can't do it in Paris or Hamburg. You got to do it in London, because that's where it's all happening, and that's a logical place to do it. And what I suggest is you buy these two businesses. And there's Simon Denyer, who had walked out literally of IMG or TWI and set up Inform, and we know with John Glazer and Steph Danner and everything, they were starting to do things together. Right. Ollie Slipper and Dennis, so they knew each other. Right. So there was an opportunity to do it. But the problem was that Sport 5, which was owned by Advent then, was going through a sale process, and they were, the runners, the front runner was probably Lagardère to buy it. So there they were trying to sell this business for sort of 850 million euros. And then there's this guy saying, for 15 million euros, we could buy these two businesses and create a digital content business. And I think while they liked the plan and the rest of it, they didn't, it was almost irrelevant, the numbers, and the timing wasn't very good. Right. And I have a very good friend of mine called Michael Lavelle, and we were in the pub in Wimbledon on a Sunday night. He'd been helping with the numbers and how to pitch it and the whole thing. And he said to me, why don't you just do this yourself? So I said, what do you mean? He said, well, it's a good idea. They sound like great businesses. The numbers make sense. Why don't you do it yourself? And I said, I don't know how to do that. He said, well, I'm not going to tell you who to ring. He said, just figure it out. I said, okay. And that was a Sunday night. I went home. I went through my database and I wrote on columns on a piece of paper everybody I knew who'd ever done a private equity deal, worked for a bank, sold their business, bought a business, anybody who was relevant. Right. And I started contacting them. And then a guy called Ian West, who used to work for Sky and was with Top Up TV or whatever, said to me, go and see a guy called Jörg Mohout. And I got to see him on the Thursday, and he was at Providence Capital, and he was literally packing his office. He was putting everything in cardboard boxes. And I said, so where are you going? He said, I'm going to work for a business called Access Industries. I said, I've never heard of it. He said, no, well, it's owned by a very interesting guy. So I pitched in the idea, and I thought that's the end of it. Right. He rang me the next day, and he said, what are we doing Monday morning? And I'm still an employee of Sport 5. So I said, nothing. He said, come and meet Len Blavatnik. Right. So there I am, 8 o'clock in the morning, Monday, Jörg's first meeting. Len's in his tennis kit, having had a tennis lesson. And I pitched him the idea. Right. And he said, well, I think that sounds really good. Let's do it. So I said, really? He said, yeah. I thought, well, this will never happen. So I go back and tell the other two boys. He said, yes. Oh, Christ, okay. So, and it involves, we've got to buy premium TV, we've got to buy Inform, and then we've got to do a deal for me to leave Sport 5 and become executive chairman and all this. And he thought, well, that's a lot of pieces to make work. Yeah. Anyway, it was all seemingly going ahead. And then Len said to me, he said, oh, by the way, he said, I've got this little sort of investment group. And he told me who was in it. And it was like, there was some Indian retail guy, and there was another guy in Thailand who was in tech, and there was somebody else. And also there was Robert Louis Dreyfus. All right. So, and he said to me, Robert would like to meet you. Can you go and see him? And I said, yeah, okay. So I get on with Eurostar and I go to Paris and I meet Robert Louis Dreyfus, and he's everything I was expecting in sort of central casting. He had torn jeans on, no shoes and socks, a T-shirt. He had the window shirt on the hottest day of the year, and he was smoking a cigar, and he had all these trading screens up. And we just started talking about Andrew Craig had just done the deal for one of his Olympic things that he'd got. It must have been a Winter Olympics because it was 2007, but he just got the bid for Vancouver or something. Right. Anyway, off he went. And like 2 hours later, we were still talking about the world of sport and sport politics. And he was absolutely fascinating, really interesting. And obviously knew it. And I just thought, God, what an amazing guy. Anyway, but I went home and the other two boys said, this will never work with all these guys. I said, no, it's not going to, because every time we're explaining who we are, we'll have to list these 10 people all over the world, including Robert Louis Dreyfus. So I had to then go back to Len and say, Len, look, we've got a bit of a problem with that. And he just said, oh, well, don't worry about them. I said, I'll just do it myself. Right. So I went, oh, great. So that's how Perform was created. And we bought the business. So I think he put in the end, the total acquisition cost was close to £25 million. So, and then off we went, and we put the two businesses together. So Premium TV and Inform became Perform,
Right.
and off we went. And Len was a fantastic shareholder. He never actually sat on the board, I don't think. I was executive chairman, and 4 years later we IPO'd that business.
Yeah. Yeah, amazing. I love it. Yeah, and since I mentioned earlier, we had John on the podcast, so we went really deep in it. So I won't go into the sort of details of the business because we dissected that pretty well already. But I'd love to hear it a bit more, just for a little bit more again on it from a chairman perspective, right? Because you went listed, then you took it off the listing again.
So when we were going to list, you have to have what I would call a proper chairman, because it's you're a public company, and therefore you have to have a proper independent chairman. Mm-hmm. So I found a guy called Paul Walker who was a proper chairman, a proper independent chairman to represent the shareholders. Right. And if I had stayed on as a non-exec, then I would be conflicted. So they'd have to get another non-exec, and that's just more money and a bigger board, and that didn't really work. So they just said to me, would you stay on as a consultant, which suited me anyway. I mean, I was I wasn't involved in the, Ollie and Simon were joint CEOs, and I know that's not universally popular in listed businesses, but, they were joined at the hip and were a great team. So it did work in our case. Mm-hmm. So I stepped down, and people still amusingly call me the chairman, but I'm not. And then after, we floated, at a capitalization of, roughly, 500 million, got it to $1 billion, and then we had a profits warning, which is another story. No. And I don't think Len ever was particularly comfortable with it being a listed business, and it wasn't really his thing. So Len took it private again, and right. And since then it has been a business where, give or take, he owns 85% of the business, and he's obviously put debt into the business. So I then just remained as a consultant to what was then Perform. It hadn't become Dazn by then, right. and just sort of, and I'm still a small shareholder in the business, so I watched it really from the sidelines. But I had nothing to do with the concept or the creation or the implementation of Dazn at all. That was really very much, Simon Denyer and Ollie left as well. Ollie had done a lot of the work that related to managing investors and shareholders. Ollie's like me, likes to start up and the rest of it. So Ollie left as well, remained as a shareholder, and Ollie then stayed on the board of Warner Music, had a very good relationship and has a good relationship with Len. So and that sort of all carried on, but obviously it's a different business now, because it is the Dazn business, and Perform obviously got hived off and sold to Vista so they could merge it with Stats Perform.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of moving parts there. Again, let's stick to it just for maybe a couple of more minutes here before we move on to some of the other interesting stories here of what you've done. The business model was a B2B model, and then you're going, with Dazn in big time into B2C, which is very different, right? In a completely different challenge, and then of course, selling off. Again, sitting.
Well, we had businesses like Gold.com, which were consumer-facing businesses. True. So, and we knew that was part of the business, but it did make a lot of sense. Obviously, Perform was a good old-fashioned profit. It made
a lot of money.
Had an EBITDA number, and you could apply a multiple to it. Dazn obviously was going to be a big financial black hole, and it was going to be a very long game in terms of investment. So they weren't a very good fit together as two businesses. It made sense to do what was done.
Right. Okay. That makes sense. Well, John didn't explain it in that way. So, but that makes sense as well. That it, because you have the businesses, it's almost they don't, as much as they complement each other in one way, I guess. It also it doesn't create the duplicating factor isn't there in value creation, like you said, because on one side you are measuring it on the profitability. The other is a typical internet digital business, which is not driven by how much money it makes, but how it's growing and its share, its user base and other KPIs you would set on it. So I can see that.
Well, I remember having a crazy conversation with some banker or private equity guy at one point who said, he said, if you're making profits, he said, I'm very strict on how I value you and what I'm allowed to, my latitude is very minimal because I know what multiples I can apply to EBITDA. But he said, if you don't make money and I'm valuing on a revenue basis, I've got a lot more flexibility.
Correct.
And I just thought, well, there's the world gone man for a start, isn't it?
Yeah, it's honestly, it took me a while.
Creatively valuing.
Yes, I have some good friends who made themselves fortunes in the internet, or what they call internet businesses, and now, of course, we call it digital businesses. And I could never figure it out. None of them were ever making money. I was making money with my businesses, and we never had the same valuations. It just didn't make any sense to me until I figured it out. And now we're sort of doing some of it too. But you rightly said, it's just completely different thinking, right? And it's almost you have to switch off your whole logic of how you've been trained to how you make money, right?
Yeah. I mean, you'd certainly, if you were valuing Dazn now, you would value it on the number of subscribers it's got, the quality of its technology, and the quality of its rights.
And the growth trajectory on the back of it.
And the growth projection, and obviously the cash flow, for example.
Yeah,
so,
correct.
When these things become cash positive.
Yeah, no, amazing. Yeah, I love it. Yeah, so you are still involved as a consultant till today, or what sort of you see yourself?
No, I'm now
still a shareholder, right? You said.
I consult with Stats Perform now.
All right.
And so I mean, we switched my relationship over to there, but I'm sort of I still obviously I am, as a shareholder, I'm still connected, and I'm still emotionally connected. There's a huge number of my friends there, and I still feel very much part of it, and I guess I always will. So, as and when I can help, if ever there's somebody I can introduce them to, or we can meet, or whatever, I would always and will always help. But I have no formal role at Dazn at all.
Got it. Okay, makes sense. Now let's talk about a couple of these other roles, which again, I'm looking at your LinkedIn profile, and that's where it comes back to what I said earlier. Being a chairman, being a consultant was several other groups here, and I just picked up one or two here, and maybe and you tell me which ones have the best stories attached here. We got Play Sports Group. We have TRM, we got the Lagio Cycle Slam. I mean, where do we start here?
Well, I would say, no question, the most interesting of those is Play Sport Group. And Play Sport Group will be known better by its the name, the Global Cycling Network, to cycling listeners out there. Right. And that was by far the most interesting one of those. And a very good friend of mine called Simon Ware, who was at Future Publishing and could see the demise of print publishing and the rise of digital publishing, and had bought Cycling News, the website, many years ago when he was at Future Publishing. And he just decided to go it alone. And he, back in sort of 2011, decided to break away and create a digital cycling agency. Right. And the idea was that it would work with cycling brands who didn't know what they should be doing in the world of digital, and that would include social media, their websites, particularly media buying. They were just, they just bought print ads in cycling magazines, and they bought some ads on Eurosport. They didn't know what they were doing. And his pitch was to go to these people and say to them, I can get you a better bang for your buck, and I can get you out there in social media, and I could manage that all for you. And they were just picking up clients. And then in about, I guess it must have been about, I'm going to say 2012, Claude Rubal is, I know, extremely well known to you and will be well known to a lot of your listeners. So I was at a conference in London, and there was Claude. Right. So I said, what are you doing, Claude? And he said, I'm just about to join Google. And I said, what are you going to do? And he said, I'm going to be global head of sport for YouTube. I said, wow, that's a big job. That's cool. And I said, what are you going to do? And he said, well, the first thing I'm going to do, he said, we want to create some verticals. I won't do his accent because I'm going to be here a long time. So he said, we're going to create some verticals. I said, well, how's that going to work? So he said, well, what we want to do is, he said, it's all about search, and the CPMs are so low. And he said, what we want to do is create destinations, create vertical channels so we can get endemic advertisers and channels, premium content. So I said, how are you going to do that? He said, we're going to seed fund some channels. Right. So I said, oh. And Claude is a big cyclist and loves triathlon, competed in Kona and all the rest of it. I know we cycled together and we love cycling. So I said, why don't we do a cycling one? And he said, great idea. He said, how about the Global Cycling Network? I said, I love it. So I said, so how does it work? he said, well, we're going to seed fund some of these to kickstart them. So I go straight back to Simon. I said, listen, there's a fantastic opportunity here. We got to do this. So we decided to go for it. And to cut the long story short, that YouTube, this was sort of autumn, and YouTube decided in the end they were going to fund about 80 channels. They had no contract, they had no template whatsoever. So we were going to go in and pitch to Europe. We were literally the first people to pitch.
Right.
And we thought, how much should we ask for? And I said 400,000, and Simon said, no, forget that. He said 1.1 million. I said, we'll never get 1.1 million. Anyway, so we go in, we asked for it, and they said, sure. Okay. so now we are, in the end, I'll tell you what happened in the end was that there were about a third of these channels failed, about a third were okay, and a third were really good. Right. And we were in the third that were really good. And what happened was they then sent us the contract for the 1.1 million. Right. And we were the first people to get the European contract. And it was the worst contract you've ever seen in your life. I mean, it was so onerous. It was just it was an advance against future advertising revenue. So basically it was a loan. Right. And they owned all the content in perpetuity. And it just went on and on. And it was such a one-sided, awful contract. I rang Claude and I said, this contract's insane. He said, listen to me, we reload, you probably won't get the money. And he said, if you really put up a fight, he said, it'll just drag on forever. So Simon and I said, I tell you what, look, it's such an awful contract. And we're betting the company, why don't we just sign it? We'll go back with one comment or two comments and we'll get the money and then we'll see what happens. Right. And he said, I think that's right, that's what we'll do. So we signed the contract, we got the money, and off we went. And they loved it so much, and they loved Simon. And he was in there, I would say, once a week, showing other people how to do it. And we created, people aren't familiar with it, go and see it, Global Cycling Network. And the really clever bit of it was that there were several things. One is that a lot of the content is what we call branded content. So it was paid for by manufacturers. So we got the bike manufacturers, people make tires and helmets and kit and tools and everything. Right. They paid, even though we kept editorial control. We kept 100% of that money. We only kept 55% of the ad revenue. And the third thing was that we sold merchandise, and we sell about 150,000 euros a month of merchandise, cycling kit. Yeah. So it had multiple revenue streams. So about a year into it, it was clear that it was going unbelievably well. But YouTube were saying, look, we'd rather you made a success of this, and we don't want you to feel that you're never going to pay back, the advertising revenue advance. So why don't we just forget the contract? So the contract was that awful, awful contract, which had never come out of the drawer. We tore it out and threw it away, and then we carried on. And we grew a really, really clever business. We had the triathlon network, the global mountain bike network, and we just decided, we looked at diversifying into other sports, but we always just said, let's just focus on cycling. And we launched in other languages. And then about 4 years ago, we needed another round of investment, and Eurosport Discovery Networks came in and took a 25% stake in the business. Okay. And we kept growing the business, and they loved it. And then because of their strategy, in early 2019, they bought the entire business. So that was a time when I stepped down as chairman. We didn't need one, and it had been a very, very successful investment, a very successful sale, and Simon Ware carried on and ran that business. But it's a beautiful case study. I would say the other thing was from day one, if we had been dependent on rights, if we had needed rights from RCS or ASO or anybody else, we wouldn't have done it. It was always the idea that we provided the content that you get on broadcasters. I mean, the coverage of cycling on television is brilliant technically in terms of the coverage of the races, but actually all the ancillary and shoulder coverage is very thin. Right. So we were effectively doing that. And we always said, so of course now, because of the relationship with Eurosport, we do have rights and contents. And if you're watching, for example, if you're watching the Welter at the moment on Eurosport, you'll see it's all co-branded with GCN presenters. It's part of that family.
Right. Got it. You guys have user-generated content as well. You're pulling in, user-generated content as well from, anyone who has interesting stories to have it as well, or is it really all purpose produced for the channel?
We always said that we would generate every single piece of footage, and we would have that. Listen, if we get race clips or stuff, or somebody sends us, yes, we do occasionally do features, and somebody will send us your best clips or whatever. But we always own all the content. We didn't want to ever have to do geo-blocking or any rights clearance or any of that. It was always 100% of the content was accessible. And we launched GCN Club and various other things. And now at the moment you can buy a pass via the GCN app to actually watch live racing, because that's all part of Discovery.
Right, and if I understood it all correctly, you started as a YouTube channel, and is it now still mostly on YouTube, or are you on other platforms too?
No, it's a YouTube channel. The YouTube channel always worked, right, because we needed a mass audience, because for the branded content we wanted the biggest audience we could have.
Got it.
And it was never suited to being a linear channel, because it's not, the content was also a lot of short form content. We would do a weekly magazine show, whatever, for half an hour, but you don't want to be scheduling channels. So no, we never wanted to put it on other platforms. Obviously, it's on other social media platforms, but it's not on. There's never been a linear cycling channel.
Yeah, great story. It makes complete sense.
It's good.
Yeah, no, that's that's a good one. Let's talk a bit about Hawkeye. And you were a consultant there for almost 10 years. And again, great business.
Tell you what happened with Hawkeye was that
tell me about it.
I was approached when Hawkeye was owned by Getty. Hawkeye was owned by Getty, and they had sort of diversified away from their core business of the photography business. There was a massive interest historically in cricket because of the Getty family, and they had bought Wisden, which is a sort of the almanac, encyclopedia of cycling cricket books. They bought Willow TV, and they'd also bought Hawkeye, but they now wanted to sell it. And in the sale process, they wanted to know what the prospects were of Hawkeye ever getting into football. And because they just had a monopoly really in tennis and cricket, but how did they get into football? Right. So I was asked to give a view on that. They paid me as a consultant, and then the deal was that whoever ended up buying it, if they wanted to keep me, they could. And Sony bought Hawkeye, and they asked me to stay on to do that role. And so I was lobbying, and my friend Jerome Valt was at FIFA, and I was lobbying because nothing could happen without FIFA agreeing to it, no matter how much pressure there was elsewhere. Yeah. And I'll tell you exactly what happened is that I was at the World Cup in South Africa, and the day before the tournament started, Sepp Blatter had been asked at a press conference, will you ever have technology in football? And the answer was no. It'll always be the same as played on a Sunday morning by amateurs with a referee and a whistle, and we'll never have technology. Right. Okay, fine. So you're thinking, well, this is not looking very good. Anyway, so I have gone up to Bloemfontein with Jerome for England, Germany. You will remember it.
Yes, I do remember.
You were there too. You were at the game.
I was in the game.
Okay,
yes.
So 5 minutes before half time, the goal that never was, Frank Lampard hits the crossbar, the ball goes over the line by about 3 feet, comes out. My phone explodes with everybody, particularly your friends, Muller, Cordes, all the rest of them. And all that, do you know what the only thing was? The only message I got? 4 numbers. 1966.
Absolutely. That's what I was thinking too. It was all retribution.
That's what they were all saying, 1966.
Exactly.
So then half-time, we go into the tribune, and in the tribune, there was a little mini tribune, which was Sepp's mini tribune. He went in there and shut the door, and he didn't come out for the whole of half-time. So we're having the whole of half-time, all of it. We watched the rest of the game. Obviously, we got thrashed. Yep. So the game finishes, we go downstairs, I get in the motorcade, I'm in the back of the car with Jerome, and his mobile goes, and there's a conversation then in French, and then he hangs up and looks at me and says, it's done. And I said, what? He said, goal line technology, it's done.
Yep.
And the really funny thing was, or amusing is that Sepp Blatter was very, very fond of telling me the story of telling everybody the story about 1986. And bizarrely, I was sitting in between my father and Phil Lines. We were in the Tribune.
You're talking about the Hand of God goal, I'm assuming, when you're talking about 1986.
Exactly.
Right,
so it was the Hand of God goal. And we were there for that game. And Sepp Blatter used to like to tell the story how after the game, my father went to see him, didn't complain, didn't want a replay, accepted it was what it was, shook Sepp's hand and says, "It's been a great tournament. Good luck with the rest of the tournament." And so Sepp had liked to quote that as his sort of quote. Of course, then we had goal line technology, and it just accelerated very quickly. I mean, it was hugely ironic that we didn't get the contract for Brazil. I mean, they gave it to somebody else, but we did get the contract for the Premier League, for Serie A, and now we do FIFA. And I say we, I'm not involved anymore. And obviously VAR has come along, and Hawkeye is doing a huge amount of the VAR as well. Though it's not as big a technical challenge, it's more a communications challenge.
Yeah, till today, absolutely. And just to add my comment to it, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, so I think that, everybody knows that, goal line technology is binary. Did the ball cross the line or not? It's very simple and it's instantaneous. I think VAR still has a long way to go, but Gianni Infantino was very keen to have it in in Russia for the World Cup, and I think they all happened very quickly. My view, I think it should have been tested in some minor or secondary leagues. And so it really worked out the protocols for it. But I guess, it's here to stay now.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, I mean, being a lifelong football fan myself, I think the technology has brought mostly positive to the game. I mean, the controversials were there anyway, right? So, and you still have it now as VR and probably less with the goal line, as you said. That's fairly clear cut, and it's just so so you can really see it well, whether it is whether it crossed or didn't cross. But you still have the discussions in a sense. You're just now debating whether VAR was right or wrong, or other things.
Correct. Exactly.
So you still have that bit of that debate.
Exactly. So you haven't lost that.
Exactly. Didn't never lose it.
No, I mean, to me, it's it should be there to correct a clear mistake, right. And therefore I don't think you need 20 replays to know if it was a clear mistake. If it was a clear mistake, you can watch it once at full speed and say, "Oh, that was clearly wrong."
Yeah, correct. Yeah, exactly.
It's not about somebody's toenail. So
exactly. That is the part where I still think they need to figure it out when we're really dealing with millimeters or like whatever, sort of barely offside with a like I said, with a toe. That's crazy. Yeah, that is a bit crazy.
I guess you don't watch a lot of cricket, but in cricket they have what's called umpire's call, which is that they go with the decision of if the ball is sort of half hitting the stumps, they go with the decision that the umpire made on the field. Right. So therefore they still stick with the umpire. So what they're basically saying, umpire's call, if it was the same in football, it would be if the offside is very, very close, you go with the original decision that the linesman or the official made. But anyway, they'll figure it out.
Yeah, I'm German. That cricket is another game altogether.
I'm aware of that.
Good stuff. Now I love this. It's funny that we were there at the same time. I was there with my dad and my 10-year-old son at that time. It was amazing.
There you go. That's amazing, isn't it?
It was, and a funny little side story to it. So of course,
well, I tell you also. Not only was I in '86, England Argentina. My father took. I think the first game he took me to. Long before he got involved with the FA, I was at England Argentina in '66 when Antonio Rattan got sent off. So I think I've done every England Argentina game since 1966. Anyway, there we go.
Amazing. Well, hopefully we'll see each other at the next World Cup. I've been to every World Cup since 1994, so that's my little.
There you go.
That's my favorite sporting event to hang out, and always great stories.
I agree with that.
It's incredible. So, look, this is also kind of gets us a little bit nicely to, maybe a bit of the finish line here. But I, definitely want to talk a bit about Oakville Sports Advisory. Again, another chairman role, chairman of the advisory board. Tell us a bit about it. What is Oakville up to, and what you do? What is your role?
Well, being chairman of an advisory board is extremely pleasant because you don't have to get involved in anything to do with actually running the business on a day-to-day basis or governance in any way at all. And they are two very, very good guys, Umbers, Doug Harmer, and they are from a financial background, and they're both City financial trained. Doug used to work, was at Wasps. Andrew Umbers was responsible for buying Leeds United for Cellini and then selling it to Drea, and they really are an interface between private equity, institutional money, and sports rights holders, and are very, very good at understanding and analysing the rights environment, the commercial environment, and strategizing in that world where finance is meeting sport, which is increasingly the way the world is going. Yeah. I mean, I certainly remember that when I was, IMG in the 90s, there were really no capital markets, or nobody IPO'd anything. It was a different world then. It was agencies. It was ISL, it was IMG, it was ProServe, it was all of that. Yep. And I think that old agency model is dead, really. Nobody would ever start an agency in the image of any of those again, because that's just not what's going to happen. I mean, you look at sort of, like the Dazn joint venture with the WTA, or what Discovery are doing with PGA Golf, all these things, and people now, and these deals that they're trying, the CVC deals, Bridgepoint deals. It is a brave new world, and a lot of people are trying to navigate that. And I think a lot of what's happened in the last 2 years has accelerated people's thinking, because people have got themselves in a big financial mess, and it has accelerated people's thinking about, what are we going to do? How are we going to navigate this? And there are lots and lots of financial solutions. Private equity is not the answer to every question. Everybody knows that there are, whether it's debt finance or securitization or short-term debt or long-term debt, there's lots of different ways of solving your financial problems beyond private equity. Bundesliga with their international rights, thinking that they want to sell it.
There are plenty of good examples.
Is that going to happen? Does it make any sense? I mean, I think, I always think you can't sell these rights twice. And, there are some extraordinary deals people trying to put out there.
Absolutely. Yeah, and CVC clearly is at the front end of it. Silver Lake is normally you hear about things they're doing, and then a few others. And it is an exciting space. So Oakwell is as an advisory. Which side do you guys advise? The private equity guys, or both sides? Okay.
Yes, absolutely. Sometimes we're paid by private equity. Sometimes we're paid by the federations or the rights holders.
Yeah. All right.
And broadcasters as well. Right. I mean, I think I see broadcasters. I was talking to a UK rights holder the other day and saying, why would I want to do a deal with private equity? Wouldn't it be more logical for me to do a deal with a broadcaster who's actually got some skin in the game here, who actually is invested in our sport, but where they want to have a long-term position in the sport? I mean, private equity, they're in it to make money. They're in it to get out of it.
Right.
I mean, they're not in it because it's in their DNA. Yeah. I mean, it might be sport today, it could be tin salmon tomorrow. I mean, it's it's not. They're not being benevolent here. I mean, they are.
Absolutely.
You can cut this out if you like. What's the difference between a venture capitalist and a sperm? And the answer is a sperm has got a 1 in a million chance of being a human being. They're not. These are hard-nosed financial people who are doing it for a good financial return. Yeah. And if they make 6% on a sports deal, but they can make 7% on a deal to do with recycling, waste management, they'll do the recycling and waste management deal.
Absolutely.
They're not, it's.
It's probably a bit harsh, but and as usual, I'm sure there, some folks from that industry listening to us will go, "Well, that's rubbish." But
I love them all, and they're lovely people. But I think it's, it's true. And you have to. That's what they do, and that's why they're very, very good at what they do. I think they do bring a huge amount of discipline to the process. I remember talking to one Serie A club chief executive. I said, why would you want to have private equity involved in managing your commercial rights? Why would you want to give anything away? And he said, because we can't do it ourselves. We just don't trust ourselves. We need the discipline that they bring.
Yeah.
Of it being structured, process, management, all the rest of it. So I said, well, do you think they will bring the right management skills and all this? And he said, well, that's another question. But listen, I think a lot of people have seen what Bridgepoint have done in MotoGP, with Dorna, and what CVC have done in Formula One, and said it can be incredibly successful. I would say there's a lot more moving parts in conventional team sports, I would say, and it's more complicated, much more complicated. The politics of it, the sustainability of it. It's simply, they're quite different. And I'm not saying it's a honeymoon period, what happened with those sports, but be interested to see what is the next big success story.
Yeah, I agree. I think we're all watching it very closely. And as coming back to our very big the conversation we had before the call, where I mentioned that we're working on something which goes in that direction, which shall remain still nameless. But the idea is exactly this. It's bringing a different type of funding opportunity to IP owners, to rights holders, which doesn't have quite the same maybe handcuffs which comes with the private equity side of it, but provides that same sort of money and brings very smart people along on the ride there. And I think that is in my view, it's a great combo, as well as something which doesn't quite exist in the industry as far as we've seen on our research.
And I think that, for many years it was given that that rights, TV rights and media rights were going to just keep going up, and is it going to be the same with data rights? But you can't make that assumption. The idea that everything is just guaranteed going to keep going up is naive. The fact is that the next generation are consuming media in a different way, in shorter forms. The linear channels are disappearing. You look at the price point for Dazn of €10 a month around the world compared to Sky TV wanted to charge you £80 or £90 a month. Right. It's a different financial dynamic.
Absolutely.
And there's different ways of, and it's not as simple as thinking, the rights will keep going up. I mean, the farce of the European Super League. I mean, who the hell was telling those guys those TV numbers? Because it was just a joke. I mean, you just sort of think, automatically, we will make this much money per game. Well, why? Right. I mean, it's I'm sorry. This is the other one. What's the definition of a consultant? Is someone who knows everything about sex but doesn't know any women. And you have people advising you on what your TV rights are worth, who actually have never sold any TV rights.
So they don't know their life. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So why would I believe some consultant or some bloke at JP Morgan who tells me what my TV rights are worth? Have you ever sold TV rights? Do you know what's actually going on in the market at the moment?
Right.
It was like when I looked around at, I was talking to John Gleaser about Bundesliga rights. You'd say, well, actually, do people actually know what's going on? The Bundesliga's probably got a very good deal in Japan, very good deal in the States. Poland is all about Lewandowski. And then a few other things. You go, actually, so Bundesliga's definitely going to keep going up, is it? And the answer is you don't know.
Yeah. Well, and look what happened in the Middle East, right? Some of the big deals there.
Exactly. And
look at China. They kicked a few out, right? And those are large numbers, which are not as simple just to make up.
Those are all the big deals and all the big markets. So have we named one market where it's actually going through the roof? The answer is no. And I think the market's going to get polarized. The things that you have to have and the things that it's quite nice to have. And Absolutely. If you get away from linear channels where you don't need to fill up your airtime with lots of rights, you'll just say, well, I'll just stick with the stuff I really need.
Yeah. And this is sort of how we look at it as well. What we're really saying with what we're building there is that we're saying, look, we rights will go up, I think, in the long run, but they will show, there could be dips and there will be new technology, whether it's OTT or other things which you need to deploy. There's new ways of monetization. Let's say if you look at NFTs and things like this. So you have to be a lot more creative, and just assuming that a broadcaster writes a check or an agency comes along and gives you a nice big fat guarantee, those days are over. And I think that's what IP owners need to be conscious of.
That is ancient history. I mean, Absolutely. Writing guarantees. I mean, it's
exactly.
in the old days, the good thing about writing a guarantee, well, they also gave you the rights and you got all the warranties that you needed. It was a two-way street. And the number of times that the guarantee never got signed because they couldn't deliver the guarantee on the other side, it often worked the other way.
Correct.
So anyway, who knows?
Yeah, no, it's exactly. We've seen all the risk and what happened with agencies or IP owners. If you look at the ISL, how they destroyed themselves, right? Crazy. But yeah.
Well, I think it goes back to ISL. To me, goes back to the nub of the agency business, which is the agency. I always thought sports agencies were like advertising agencies. You can have all the contracts you liked in the drawer, but in the end, it's about the people. Did you have good people? Did you have the best people? Because if you haven't, agencies have to reinvent themselves all the time, because the better job you do, the more likely you are to get fired by the client. They then don't need the guarantee because they say we can do it ourselves and all our sponsors will renew. Yeah. So you've got to have the best creative people out there going out, coming up with new ways to make money, new ways to do deals, and all the rest of it. And I think that, ISL was the classic. They had the best people, and they let them all go.
Yeah.
They went off and did other things.
I like what you said. It makes me feel a little better, because if I look back at 20 years now of TSA here, how many times we worked ourselves out of a job. Whether it was WWE or whether it was US Open tennis or badminton or you name it, it was always the same story, like you just said. And it's funny enough, during those times when it happens, it's not how you look at it, right? You're upset, you're pissed off because you're building it all up, and then someone comes along, or the rights holder takes it in house. But if you now looking at back in the way you just referring to it, yeah, it's just what it is. That's literally the life cycle. What I guess an agent's supposed to do, right? You help bring it up, and then either someone bigger comes along, or they take it in house, and so that is the game they play. We all play it to some degree.
No, it's absolutely true, and I think that it's an end of an era of many of them are on your podcast. It's a whole generation of people who were in the business that we all grew up with, and who have all retired or partly retired or sort of now on the fringes of it. Many of my contemporaries we're just not in the front line of the business anymore. We love doing our things that we do, but we don't go to the office every day.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think, but I do think when you look at the agencies which are still there, whether it's on the biggest level with IMG or Endeavor now or Sport 5, of course, they are truly reinventing themselves, right? Many are also going into other areas, from esports to gaming, which of course is there is similarities, and therefore there are some of the skill sets you can transfer over. Massively booming space and exciting in many ways, and we're doing that as well. And so then you bring a bit of crypto in with the NFT space. So there is always new things.
Well, this is the problem, Mark. My view was I would never have to learn anything new, and then suddenly I have to learn what a SPAC is, and then I have to learn what an NFT. It's going to be something else next week, and I go, oh, God, what the hell does this mean? And it's bizarre, isn't it? It's a little bit crazy at the moment, but there we go.
Yeah, well, that keeps us young, right? So, Andrew, this was fun here. I really enjoyed this.
I think the great thing about our business is that nobody ever wants to retire from this business because it's too much fun.
Absolutely.
And I think of all the events I've been to over the years and all the people that I've met, you would never walk away from that because it's the most fun. And I think that's what I've missed the last 2 years, without any question. It's actually just getting on a plane and going to events, and whether it's everything, whether it's a Lions tour or whether it's the Olympics or whatever it is, you just know how great, like you and your father and your son in Bloemfontein, it's the best thing you'll ever do. I took my son to the German World Cup. We went to a game a day for 14 days, and he was like 12 years old. It was just, life experience.
Absolutely.
And in the last 2 years, we haven't had that.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think we all miss that, and we can't wait for the doors to probably be back open, and some area, right? If I look at it, the UK, the stadiums are full. Scares me a little bit, to have to admit, when I see it.
No, we are back fully up and running. It's still very tough, I think, for the athletes, because the athletes are still having to protect themselves. They're in bubble. It's putting pressure on their families and the rest of it. Whereas we are all just now going back to games. We've got full stadia, and ostensibly it's normal.
Yeah. Let's knock on wood. It all goes well there.
Anyway.
Andrew, that was a lot of fun here. I really enjoyed this.
Oh,
I think we're almost got a good, almost an hour and a half in here, which great stories, lots of amazing history in the world of sports and the roles you played. And as I said, as the chairman in many cases, so clearly that is the role. And I'm sure you'll be having many of those coming here. So thank you for your time. And I'm sure we'll talk some more.
Absolute pleasure.
The Sports Entrepreneurs by Marcus Luer podcasts are a collection of interviews and stories. All content in this podcast is the copyright of Marcus Luer. Reproduction and distribution of the presentation without written permission of the owner is prohibited. All rights reserved.